The Drinks Adventures podcast is proudly supported by our friends at Bintani, Australia's leading supplier of ingredients for the brewing and distilling industries. Bintani has all the ingredients you need, and they have experts in all categories on the team, so they understand how ingredients work together like no other supplier. Bintani handpicks the best. I'm James Atkinson, and this is Drinks Adventures, the podcast where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and explore trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Welcome to this second season of Drinks Adventures. Feels very good to be able to finally say that I had hoped that I would be talking to you a couple of months earlier than this, but I'm sure that with the content we have coming up this season, it will have been worth the wait. Now, we kick off this season with an in-depth look at the brewery founded in Byron Bay, Australia in 2008, S2E1 Wood Brewing Company. But in fact, this story isn't only about S2E1 Wood, it's also a bit of a look at the current state of play in Australian independent brewing, an industry sector that is in the midst of an unprecedented boom that is not without its challenges. Now, otherwise, this story pretty much speaks for itself, so let's get straight into it. And remember, you can find more on this episode at drinksadventures.com.au and stick around at the end for some updates on how this podcast is going to run throughout this season.
I guess just a little bit about our story. I guess the S2E1 Wood story started when the three of us, Brad, Ross and myself, decided to quit our corporate gigs and put the house on the line and do our own thing, start our own brewery.
The way they set that up originally, with the investors they had, with the location they had, with the access to taps they had, really it gave them the best start you could possibly hope to have with a business like that. I mean, they really made sure their stars were aligned correctly before they even started making beer.
Jamie, Brad and Ross all had the experience themselves through Matilda Bay from a corporate point of view, but they also, I think, had the right mentality going into running their own business. If you spot somebody who's capable of being an entrepreneur, they have a view that they are going to have to take salary drops and mortgage houses and buy old cars to kind of start and keep costs under control. So everything they were saying was not indicative of some people who leave the corporate world and expect everything to be the same. So I think it's a really important point. These guys were really doing it on the smell of an oily rag and risking everything, really.
S2E1 Wood Brewing Company was founded by Jamie Cook, Brad Rogers and Ross Juricic in 2008. The trio famously met each other while working for Australia's largest brewing company, Foster's, and hatched the plan to launch their own brewery in Byron Bay. This is Jamie speaking at the Telstra Business Awards in 2014.
If it wasn't for the good people of the Northern Rivers, we wouldn't be here. The real support of the local community up there, and Byron is a fantastically strong community spirit that really attracted us to the region. They really celebrate diversity. They really understand that, local spirit is what it's about. And without their support and without selling beer in the local pubs up there, we wouldn't be here accepting this award tonight.
We consider our backyard to be anywhere from a 3-hour drive of Byron Bay. So north to Hervey Bay really and south to Coffs, arguably. 50% of our beer is still sold within that 3-hour drive.
And that was Ross Juricic. But in just 10 years, S2E1 Wood has gone far beyond being a successful regional brewer to become a genuine national player in the Australian beer market. Alexis Reutman is CEO of the Independent Brewers Association.
We have a lot of very small brewers around the country. About 75% of my members are in the smallest production volume band, so less than 100,000 litres. And of course we have some really big ones as well, but there's only one member over 5 million litres.
That one member is S2E1 Wood, which produced in excess of 12 million litres of beer last year.
Little Creatures got to a certain size. Cooper's is obviously significantly larger than you guys are and still independent. Where do you guys sit in terms of what you've managed to achieve?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you look at it, it's probably not just modern, it's probably from, let's say, the last 70 years of the Australian brewing industry. There's only been a handful of regional brewers that have actually sort of grown from their own home base, and Cooper's would be one. Bogues, Cascade, Little Creatures are a cluster of brewers that have probably jumped from being a small sort of regional player to something on a national basis, and not much else at scale. So I guess we're probably in that club. And when you look at us in that club, it's a fairly handsome sort of club to be in.
Well, I think when you look back 10 years ago and see what was actually happening in the Australian brewing industry, realistically there was a lot of small breweries and no one really looking at paving the way to have independent beer available to all their fans around Australia. So that's what Stone & Wood has done. They've been the first independent brewery in Australia to be able to service their fans all around Australia.
That was Richard Watkins from Canberra's Bent Spoke Brewing Company. Founded in 2000 and now part of multinational-owned Lion Beer Australia, Little Creatures is the only other brewery in the modern era to have achieved a similar feat to that of Stone & Wood. This is one of the founders, Howard Cairns.
When we started Little Creatures, I remember Nick and I having a chat about that exact point, that in 100 years, there'd been some attempts, but largely the brands that were the brands were the brands. There were very few in that sort of whole time frame that had actually cracked through to establish what you'd probably really call true brand value, and that being, national awareness, national distribution. Because if you think about a lot of the craft players, they have a multitude of SKUs, etc., that, are all a bit bitsy. Whilst they might be nice little businesses, they struggle to really get the scale that someone like Stone & Wood and Little Creatures. It's about having a flagship brand, or a flagship product, I should say, that is really meeting the demands of the consumer and is able to sort of crack through all those trade barriers.
Flagships don't come much bigger than Pacific Ale, the only beer that has been on the winners' podium in the influential Gab's Hottest 100 Aussie Craft Beers poll 9 years running, among other accolades.
And it's official, we've just seen the number one, that Stone & Wood is indeed number one.
I'm Steve Jeffers and I'm one of the founders of the Gab's Beer, Cider and Food Festival, as well as the local tap house in St Kilda in Melbourne. There's not a huge number of beers that have been around for as long as the Hottest 100 poll has been around when we started it at the local tap house originally. But the fact that it's the only beer that has resisted the drop, if you like. There are other beers like Little Creatures Pale Ale, most notably, Feral Hop Hog, to name another, that have slid down the rankings for a variety of reasons, I imagine, but somehow Pacific Ale has managed to stand the test of time in a hyper-competitive market when now there are so many options. It's quite remarkable that they have managed to stay at the pointy end of the poll consistently for so long.
It was at a time when everyone else was sort of amping the hops up, and they came out with this beer that it turned out people just wanted to drink.
Matt Kierkegaard speaking there, founder of leading beer publication Australian Brews News. Pacific Ale accounts for 90% of Stone & Wood's total production. Its signature tropical aromatic profile is thanks to the Galaxy hop variety developed by Hop Products Australia. Tim Lord is Managing Director of HPA.
Brad came across it originally in his role with Matilda Bay, with samples that were supplied to CUB, and he'd done a bit of work with it and was aware of the hop, and hence he was interested in the characteristics and the possibility or the future of using it in a Stone & Wood beer when they started up in 2008.
Doing what we were doing back in the Empire, you came across so many different flavours, so many different hops. It was something that I sort of, came across back in those days. I just put that up my sleeve and, at the right time brought it out for Pacific Ale. And the main flavour in that hop is very much a passion fruit, tropical fruit, mango, that sort of light, fresh, very aromatic hop. And back when Pacific Ale came out, there was nothing like it.
Arguably today it sits in Australian summer ale class, brand. But back then there was no style for it, so we had to come up with another name, and we thought, well, what are we going to call it? Still an ale. We're as close to the Pacific Ocean as any other brewery in Australia, that's for sure. So we said, well, let's just call it Pacific Ale.
And we thought Byron, the quintessential beer occasion in Byron is you come out of the surf, main beach, you walk across the sand, over the park, into the beach hotel and the beer garden. You still got that salt water drying on your back, and you order a schooner, and that first beer you have is just this thirst-quenching moment. So that was really what we were trying to develop in a beer, and Brad did a fantastic job of developing this beer that had that incredibly aromatic nose to it that sort of got your attention the moment you picked a schooner up to it.
In parallel with the success of Pacific Ale, the Galaxy hop has turned into a global smash hit for HPA, featuring in beers produced by craft beer heavyweights such as Beavertown, Treehouse and Trillium. I asked Tim Lord whether I'd heard correctly. that Pacific Ale had played a vital role in introducing Galaxy to the world.
Oh, there's no doubt about that at all. That is absolutely 100% true. That Stone and Wood Pacific Ale, I used it relentlessly to show brewers. I took Eskies full of it with me to Europe to showcase Galaxy, and to this day it remains one of the very few beers in the world that you can take into a hop garden and grab a fresh Galaxy cone off a mature hop plant, rub it and smell it, and then open a Stone and Wood beer and have a drink, and like people just get it. That just reflects Galaxy really, really, really well.
The Silver Award goes to Pacific Ale, Stone and Wood Brewing Company, Byron Bay, Australia.
Choosing Byron was clever. There's a huge population draw around there, and it's got identity and depth to it, if you like, with regards to what you can talk about with the brand.
Howard Cairns again. He joined the board of Stone and Wood in 2009, when Little Creature's then ASX-listed parent company, Littlewell Beverages, acquired a 20% share in Stone and Wood.
You know, we'd already put our houses on the line for this thing, so nothing much else to put on the table, really. We decided we probably needed to bring in a fifth investor, and we kicked around the idea of what that sort of investor would need to look like. We didn't want to bring just someone in who just brought money to the table. We wanted someone to come in who understood the business we were in, understood how long any payback would be, and maybe who could add some other strategic value. And we looked at a few different options, but settled on tapping the guys from Little Creatures on the shoulder, because I'd worked with them in a previous life back in the early Matilda Bay days in the 80s. And at that time, they were chugging along. They were market leaders.
We knew they could make great beer through Brad, and Jamie knew a lot about the whole business, if you like. Bringing on board Ross and their other shareholder, Tom, was not dissimilar to the way we started, making sure we had the right team in place with the various skill sets. It's very hard to do what they've done and what we did with just one person. You've got to get a lot of things right in the beer game, and so having the right people was important.
We said, look guys, would you be keen to join in, put some money on the table and act as our mentors around the board table? And given they'd been through what we were about to go through, it seemed like the right thing to do. They were pretty keen on it. They liked what we brought to the table in terms of the business, our combined skills, etc. So they put some money in, and that sort of helped get us through that early patch. We knew they had Lion there as a shareholder, but a minority shareholder at that time. I think they had about 25% of Little Creatures at that time.
Littlewell Beverages shareholders have approved the $362 million takeover bid from Gaelic Investments, a wholly owned subsidiary of Lion. An overwhelming 99.97% were in favour of the deal that will see the company delist from the ASX, becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of the Japanese brewer Kirin Brewery.
2012, when Lion moved on them, it gave us the opportunity to revisit that. We had a change of control clause in our shareholders agreement, which allowed us to buy those shares back. And the timing couldn't have been better. It was just one of those times in your life, there's just perfect timing, because we were only just becoming profitable, and the valuation we bought the shares back from them was a historical valuation. And since we hadn't made any money at that point, pretty much we gave them the money they put in back.
Were you surprised that they decided to buy Lion out?
Not at all. I think one of the things that benefited a lot of players with the sale of Little Creatures was the recognition that these sort of breweries had value. Suddenly, therefore, capital was more readily available, not just to Stone and Wood, but to others.
The Creatures Lion deal happened in June, but it actually couldn't get in front of the Little Creatures shareholders until October. So there was, 4 months period where we were basically being seduced by everyone at Lion, providing us every reason in the world why they should still show as a shareholder. And we had some great bottles of wine, courtesy.
Saw some great wine.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, it didn't take us long to realise that why we got into this in the first place was to get out of corporate life and do our own thing. And stepping back into that wasn't in our psyche. We did this for a reason, and it wasn't just to get back into having corporate sitting on your shoulder.
In 2016, the Stone and Wood parent company was rebadged as Fermentum, a new corporate identity for the family of proprietary brands that now includes Stone & Wood, Granite Belt Cider Company and Fixation Brewing Company. Last year, Stone & Wood established the Ingrained Foundation, a national not-for-profit that supports grassroots, environmental and social charities. The brewery now has 135 employees, and Ben Summons is Managing Director.
We take the role of being the village brewer, really seriously about, the being the hub of the village and trying to create value for all those communities around us, our local communities of drinkers, suppliers, customers and so forth. Over the journey through our fundraising over the last 10 years, we've been able to raise over $630,000 through donations of $1 per hectolitre and raising money at key events and things like Karma Kegs. So the Ingrained Foundation is sort of formalising that process going forward.
Good beer with a story is always going to come out at number one. Your story needs to be real. Whatever story you're telling has to have integrity in it. You actually have to walk the talk, and which is such a silly thing to say, but they do that. The things that they say, they do, and on some level that resonates.
Matt Kierkegaard again. While Stone & Wood has maintained its independence with ownership controlled by the three founders and Northern Rivers publican Tom Mooney, several of its counterparts have been snapped up by multinational brewers in recent years. After Little Creatures in 2012, fellow pioneers Mountain Goat sold to Asahi in 2015. Feral Brewing, Pirate Life and Four Pines were soon to follow.
I think what we're talking about is 6 such trade sales in the last 10 years, out of 600 brewers. It's not a concern for us, and I think, as you can see with the sales data, the IRI sales data for last year, our independent industry in terms of sales is still growing strongly. So what that is telling us is that even with Pirate Life and Feral taken out of that equation, we're still growing strongly. We're still delivering a hell of a lot of value. People are starting to attach a premium, starting to consider important the ownership of the beer.
Alexis Reutman there. Regardless of how few trade sales there have been relative to the number of breweries that exist in Australia, that trend among breweries that have achieved a certain scale has inevitably created speculation around the next chapter for Stone & Wood.
What's your plan moving forward for what you see happening in terms of succession planning for the business? There's only one trajectory that most drinkers know of in the craft beer space, and that's that you grow to a certain point until you're ready to cash in and then you sell to one of the majors.
We've always been of the opinion that a business without direction and a business without a succession plan is a business for sale. For Mentum or Stone & Wood, we have direction and we have a succession plan. So over the last couple of years, Jeremy, Brad and myself have gone about replacing ourselves within the business, arguably with smarter people than us. Not arguably, definitely. People sell for different reasons, and we've seen a lot of it recently. A lot of it comes down to founder fatigue and where to from next, or it could be a lack of expertise to keep going on their own.
Listen, I think they've made pretty clear that they will continue to exist as an independent brewery, and there's nothing that indicates to me that they're going to do a Little Creatures. I think that the three lads have managed to largely replace themselves in the company with people as talented, if not more so, than they are. They plan to fly the independent flag strongly as far into the future as I can see.
They've done an amazing job. I think where they find themselves after 10 years is really something to be celebrated and something that we, I think, certainly all look to across the industry.
That's Jane Lewis, co-founder of Two Birds Brewing Company. Dave McGill is head brewer at Moo Brew, another influential Australian brewery that started up in the last decade.
It's a pretty amazing level of growth in such a short period of time. 10 years really doesn't seem that long when you look at the lifespan of a brewery like that. And what they've managed to achieve is nothing short of remarkable, that's for sure.
I think there was the time of Matilda Bay and Hahn and a few others, but that sort of was a wave that really never got to the heights it probably should. And then you had, I guess, the Little Creatures, Mountain Goat, and I guess you could call it a pale ale IPA wave. And that was certainly when Stone & Wood came into it, but put their own spin on it, particularly with Pacific Ale. I think they're going past us where we were, the rate of knots, and given the growth in the craft beer market and various players being swallowed up and, they've stayed independent, I think, there's a lot of headroom left for them. So I think they are an extraordinary business and they'll continue to be an even more extraordinary business.
So what does Stone and Wood look like in 20 or 30 years then? If you're not going to sell the business, you've got to do something with it.
It'll continue to grow. I said that momentum will continue. In terms of ownership, there's 4 founding families that own the bulk of the business, nearly 80% of the business. So the rest of it is owned by a handful of minority investors. And then there's at the moment 75 employees, nearly 70% of the business that own us as well. And that number will continue to grow every year. But 20 years time, it could be the Coopers of the East Coast. That's probably what our vision is. It's to be a regional brewer. And if it takes us 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to achieve that, so be it.
I think at the end of the day, what we've been able to achieve outside of a large business has been quite phenomenal. And the 3 of us are a great team. We get on very, very well. And I think the really nice thing is the 3 of us love what we do. And I think that's the important thing that comes out in the Stone and Wood business. We're sort of chasing ghosts by wondering what would have happened if we all would have stayed back in the Foster's business.
This episode would not have been possible without the generosity of the organisations that gave me permission to use their audio. So thank you to the Telstra Business Awards, Finance News Network and Matt Kierkegaard at Australian Brews News. Thanks also to the wonderful music acts that cleared their tracks for use on the show. From London, Asad Rizvi aka Silverlining, from New York City, No Regular Play, and from my hometown of Sydney, We Lost the Sea. And if you watched the recent Ricky Gervais series Afterlife on Netflix, you may have heard We Lost the Sea's tune, A Gallant Gentleman, feature on the soundtrack. Ricky is a big We Lost the Sea fan, and I'm privileged to be able to use the same track on this episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode on Stone and Wood, go back to Season 1, Episode 3 and check out my interview with Janice McDonald, who was the first head brewer at Little Creatures. It'll give you some fantastic insights into Australian independent brewing in the decades prior to Stone and Wood's arrival. Thank you to the companies that have sponsored the Drinks Adventures podcast as of this year. The support of our major partner Bintani and other brands makes the show viable, so I'm very grateful for it, and I'm sure our listeners are too. Now, there were a few iTunes reviews that came in while the show was on hiatus, so thanks a lot firstly to Buster AU, who says, "We all like to have a bit of knowledge that the people you're with don't. That's part of the reason for drinking with friends. The Drinks Adventures podcast with James Atkinson is now your trump card. James's casual interview technique allows the podcast to feel like we're sitting there at the table chatting as well. Even when it's on a topic that's not in my drinks cabinet, my attention is held fixed because you know it will be enjoyable and full of great information." Now, thanks, Buster. I swear I did not write that myself. Thanks also to Lee of Brisbane, aka Lethal Razorback, who says, "James was very good with Brews News. Glad to see he has expanded this podcast to cover a whole variety of interesting subjects." Now, I know some listeners enjoy the weekly giveaways we had throughout Season 1. We're still going to be doing some of those whenever we can, but you'll just have to keep an eye on my Facebook page for announcements of those competitions. The page is called James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, and you can find it at facebook.com/by James Atkinson. I look forward to having your company again soon. The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at by James Atkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.